Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Build It Better Architecture. Today, we will be having a very dynamic conversation about static site generators. And joining me for that today are Jason.
Hello.
Phil.
Hi.
Kian.
Hello.
And Lindsay.
Hello there.
And I am Jay, a software architect at This.Labs. Do each of you want to say where you're from, what you do?
Sure. I'm Jason Langsdorf. I am the VP of Developer Experience at Netlify.
And I'm Phil Hawksworth. I'm based in the UK. I'm also at Netlify, part of Jason's team, working in developer experience as well.
Hi, I'm Lindsay, and I'm a senior software engineer at This.Labs. I'm also in the UK from a small country called Wales, and I love working with React.
Hi, my name is Kian. I am a senior software engineer at This.Labs, and I am based in Utah in the US.
I forgot to say where I was from. I'm in Portland, Oregon.
I'm from a lot of places currently in Canada. Yeah, so I think we should start out by maybe pinning down what we're talking about. What is a static site and what is a static site generator? Anyone want to take us off?
Ooh.
Laying some groundwork?
I'll have a go. Can I have a go?
You can have a go.
Okay. So I think a static site generator is a tool that you can use to turn templates and content and data into a bunch of assets and resources that you can deploy as a website. So I think of it as going back in the day when we used to, build things that ran in a server, maybe using something like, I don't know, PHP or .NET or what have you, where, for each request, something would come in and you'd apply templates and you'd have things like server-side includes and all of those kind of things that would help you generate all your HTML. It's doing that, but instead of doing it in a server at request time, it's doing it ahead of time at build time. So it's a big machine that you can crank the handle and it generates your HTML for you. That's the way I think of a static site generator.
Yeah, I'd say that's accurate.
Thank goodness.
Yeah, and the great thing with these is that because we now live in a world where we have these like very international, very fast CMSs. Oh, no, CMSs. This is when my sort of difficulty with words comes in.
Yeah.
Netlify and CloudFront and
Talking about CDNs.
Yeah,
CDNs. See, I get the acronyms mixed up in my head. CDNs. That if you can have things done at build time and then they're hosted statically, then that gives you better performance and cuts costs for everyone involved, because you can cache it easily, and we all know that knowing when and how to cache is one of the two hard problems in computer science.
Mm-hmm.
What static site frameworks and generators do each of you have experience with?
The first experience I had was around 6 years ago, I think, with Jekyll. I used that to build my personal blog. And I actually hadn't really touched any other static site generators until probably around 4 months ago when I started looking at Gatsby and Next. But I guess there's probably way more tools out there that are available.
I've had experience with Next and with Nuxt. Nuxt first for a few years, and then Next after I had taken a detour from React to Vue back to React.
Oh, interesting. About you, Jason?
I have worked with, at this point, I think I've worked with all of them. as a kind of a byproduct of my show. So professionally, like actually building things with them, I've used Jekyll, Hugo, Gatsby, one that I don't think is maintained anymore called Hexo, and one called Toast that's a little under the radar, built in Rust. I've built my own personal sites in those over the years. And then professionally, I've used Next and Next, Gatsby, ViewPress, 11D, and a handful more as like projects for Netlify. And then more recently, I've been using Astro and SvelteKit a lot because they feel like, to me at least, they kind of feel like the new generation of like where web development's going to go. And so I'm trying to get more experience with those as well.
Yeah, same for me. I'm on the similar kind of trajectory, experimenting with those kind of emerging tools as well. But yeah, I think my first static site generator might have been Bash. Bash and Makefiles before I really knew what a static site generator was. But certainly I worked on web projects where I wanted some templating and I was generating a bunch of HTML files, but there wasn't really a static site generator tool, or there probably was. I probably invented something that existed because that's what we do as developers very often. But it certainly wasn't a popular pattern. So I thought I was terribly clever doing that. And then it turned out that there were hundreds of static site generators out there. But the first one I really used that was a tool that someone else had created and documented was, like Lindsay, it was Jekyll. And that's what really made me fall in love with static site generators as tools and as a model for kind of helping me automate the process of generating a site ahead of time. And I think it was GitHub Pages that really kind of sealed the deal for me. It's like, oh, well,
yeah.
I can commit my changes and a build magically happens. That just threw the doors open for me and got me very excited about building things with that. So, but along the way, I've experimented with a ton of them, many that Jason kind of mentioned. I think one that didn't get mentioned along the way, or maybe I missed it, was 11T, which is one that I'm very enthusiastic about at the moment because it fits with my brain. And I have noticed that there are so many static site generators out there because people have different mental models, and lots of people are trying to solve a very similar thing. So lots of people have created those of their own. But the ones mentioned already, I think, are the popular ones that certainly have got my attention as well.
I sort of started with, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Jay. Sorry.
Yeah, I sort of started with Jekyll and 11T. Problem for me is that I really don't like Markdown. So I was then had a long time of like really falling in love and then out of love with Gatsby, because you could connect any sort of like external data source to it. But then it was really kind of overly complicated to do that for all of them and transforming everything into GraphQL. So yeah, I've used Next, and now actually I am building professionally something with Astro to sort of test it out, see how that goes, because I agree, like this, I think we're in the part of the development cycle of these tools where we're it's funny how tools start out complex and get simple. And I think that, we started out where with tools like Jekyll that you had I could only do a very specific thing with very specific data sources. And then Gatsby said, oh, what if you could plug in anything, but it has to be through this GraphQL API? And then, Next and Nux said, well, why don't you just write code? Just write this function that runs at build time, and it can have whatever you want. And that's sort of, what I think Astro is bringing as well. Like, just write code, it gets executed. And we've gone full circle, and we're now like, it's basically Bash with Makefiles, but with nicer tooling around it.
So
Yeah,
say,
I like the constraints that that came along with static site generators, particularly in the early days, because I think that helps kind of keep you very clear in your mental model of, okay, how am I building this site? When, you know, when can accidents happen? I like the fact that mistakes happen in my house rather than in the user's house, if you like, because, you know, it's when I run the build. If it's going to break, it breaks then. Once it's built and it's successful, it's like, okay, I've got pretty good confidence that people requesting these things is going to work, because nothing has changed since I successfully built it. But I know that the edges are getting a little bit blurred now with, you know, static site generators or frameworks that give you more than just generating the site, because now they can be doing things dynamically as well. And so I think that's both a blessing and a curse. I love having the power to do that, but knowing when to do that is, I think, is the next kind of, I was going to say the next frontier. That's maybe a bit grand, isn't it, for this conversation? But the next challenge of this kind of architecture is understanding when to use it and when to use something different, and, you know, using the right tool for the right job.
I have so many thoughts on that, but I know Lindsay was going to say something, so I'll hold off for a second.
yeah, no, I was just really curious about Eleventy. It's the first time I've actually heard of it. Is it framework agnostic, or does it work with a specific framework?
It's agnostic. I think of it as Jekyll, but built with JavaScript instead of Ruby for the, you know,
Okay.
line. It has very many similar conventions, but yeah, it doesn't ship any JavaScript by default. It only outputs the JavaScript you tell it to by writing JavaScript. So it is very similar to Jekyll in many ways, but built on the JavaScript ecosystem rather than on the Ruby ecosystem.
Cool.
Yeah, I kind of want to just build a little bit on what Phil was talking about with the, you know, the constraints, and then the where do we draw the line, right? Because I feel like when I first started out using Jekyll and Hugo and these things, like they are, you know, Jekyll, Hugo, and Eleventy all feel like kindred spirits. One is written in Go, one is written in Ruby, one's written in JavaScript, but ultimately they're taking templates and data and they're outputting HTML and CSS. That's it. They don't have JavaScript. They don't use frameworks. They just output plain old HTML, CSS, which is wonderful for a lot of use cases. If you're building a blog, if you're doing static content that like really doesn't have any interactivity. But in each of those frameworks, when I started working with them, I found myself hacking the framework to add interactive components. So I had my Hugo site and I'd hacked in a little bit of React to make my newsletter opt-in dynamic and interactive. And I'd hacked in this little thing where I could, like, you know, make a part of the image when you scrolled over it, it was like an interactive infographic, because I had this idea for a blog post. And I just kept fighting the frameworks because I wanted a little bit of framework. But then I feel like we all overcorrected. Like, as an industry, we were like, okay, well, we need some JavaScript to make the things do what we want them to do. So then we turned to Gatsby and to Next, where it's like, okay, you want one interactive element, the whole website's JavaScript now. And so suddenly we're shipping 300-400 kilobytes of JavaScript for like one interactive button. It's like, ooh, okay, maybe we overcorrected here, right? And so what I find really exciting is stuff like Astro, where what I want, like, here's what I want ultimately. I want to write sites in a way that is comfortable to me and lets me accomplish all the things that I want. I really like using component-based frameworks for that. Vue, React, Svelte, they're all good at this. But I don't actually want to ship that, right? What I want to ship is HTML and CSS. And that's why I'm excited about Astro, and Solid.js is good at this, and SvelteKit is good at this, where you write in a component-based language, and then during the build step, everything gets compiled away to HTML and CSS, except in the case where you explicitly say, hey, this piece is interactive, so like turn it into a little JavaScript app. And so I can have my one little opt-in section that has, you know, JavaScript validation and a little animation when you click the button and the little fun stuff that I want to put on my site. But everything else that doesn't need to be interactive is still just HTML and CSS. So instead of shipping 300 or 400 kilobytes of JavaScript, I'm now shipping like 25 because I used Preact. And that to me is amazing. Like, I love that we get to build in the way that we want to build, but we don't like push off the weight of our decisions onto our users in the browser. And that's why I think like Astro and SvelteKit really feel like what's next, right? I think that everything, like, the ones that are shipping gobs of JavaScript like Next and Gatsby, they're going to have to shift the way that they do it to match this paradigm, because I don't think developers are going to want to keep shipping tons and tons of JavaScript if they don't have to.
Yeah, I think that it used to be that I was sort of, making decisions and building out the framework for this very large, in parts, really, really interactive site. And every time we had these conversations of like, yeah, but all of this part of the site, like all of these like landing pages, all of these marketing pages, they're static. So why do we have to have them in React? Why do we have to why do they have to like go through all of this process and be shipped to the user and all that? And it's so hard to make it performant. And we want the performance because these are landing pages. We want the SEO, we want the user experience of getting them in snappily. And we tried all sorts of things, and and in the end, it's like, well, we can make them static, but then we have all of this component library, this design system, and this is all made with components that we couldn't ship in for the static part. We'd have to duplicate a huge amount of design effort just for this, and then there's problems of like ensuring design consistency between pages, because like I think we talk about component frameworks a little bit of like, oh, it just helps developers do their job, but it has a real sort of user benefit as well, which is that it's providing like a real consistent experience where if you do it right, every time a user sees an element on the page, the element is going to behave the same way, because it is the same component. You don't see this thing where like you're navigating through some of these pages, sometimes like these old legacy corporate pages. I'm thinking like of our like utility company and things where you navigate through, and as you go through, things look similar but not exactly the same and behave similar but not exactly the same, and it just adds this layer of frustration for the user of trying to figure out how it works.
But that's why I really like the model that things like Astro have got, like as Jason mentioned, allows you to build with those kind of components and those library resources, but those do get compiled away down to something that can ship and is rendered ready to go, rather than having to push that burden into the browser. I love as someone who's been a developer for a long time, I've really enjoyed developer tooling and developer experiences getting richer and more satisfying and feeling more immediate. I mean, it was that immediacy that led me to building for the web in the first place, that in fact, you edit a file and you save it and you hit refresh and then ta-da, there's no compiling, there's the rest of it. But having that kind of immediacy of experience felt like a real luxury for developers. But if that has been at the expense of the user experience or shipping some of the risk to the user or the client, if you like, then that's where I think there's some dangerous water. So I really like the fact that there's a trend at the moment, I think, to giving developers that experience and that productivity and that consistency that you mentioned, but then not in having that at the expense of the user experience. So we can have our cake and eat it, if you like.
Yeah, I would agree. I think too that one of the things that frameworks, or as they're now sort of becoming, sort of does as well, is benefit maybe developers who aren't quite as aware of maybe other patterns and other practices, because of that ecosystem, that community that's sort of built around that framework. People get the chance to learn different things. They get exposed to different topics. They see maybe sort of best practices of, how to accomplish something. Whereas, when something is more sort of bare bones, you're kind of like, well, if you don't have the experience, what do I do here to achieve this, that, or the other? I do think though that there's got to be some sort of midway point, right? Where, you don't have 300, 400 megs in your browser loading a site, but you still get that sort of experience of sort of that built-in framework, so to speak. I know just from my experience with Next and Nuxt takes, I think, more of a framework approach than maybe Next does, because when you generate a site with Nuxt, like there is all of these like readmes in every folder telling you like what this is for, and here's some docs to go learn how to do it. And, they'll generate, the whole thing for you. It'll generate ESLint, prettier formatting, everything, testing, integration testing. So I think, some of those things have grown and like you said, favor the developer, but I think there's, where do you call it?
Mm.
Yeah, my thought is like, even I think there's even thoughts amongst the framework developers, like the library developers about this, because I don't know how up to date you are on, for example, React server components proposals and what they're trying to do to also like enable like as a first class sort of island architecture and shipping less JavaScript to the browser. Like I think there's a big convergence towards this idea of like using JavaScript but shipping less of it, and
Yeah.
these islands of interactivity that has always been, I guess, like it was how the web was. I guess not at first, but like you're even talking about like jQuery UI and things like that, where like most of your site wouldn't be JavaScript, and then these little widgets would be JavaScript, and we're sort of finding that again, but in a better way.
jQuery UI brings back some memories.
Yeah.
Definitely. So it's really interesting to hear you talk about sort of these newer frameworks that don't ship JavaScript to the browser. Now, if I was someone who wanted to create just a blog, so I just wanted to share my posts, I didn't want really or little to no interactivity, what would be the framework of your choice or static site generator of your choice? Would that be something like Astro?
I mean, I this is going to be the most like typical developer answer, but it depends.
Yeah.
I feel pretty strongly that the right tool is the one that solves the problem at hand and solves a problem that you see 6 months down the road. Like I don't think you should plan for 5 years in the future. I think that tends to lead to a little bit of over engineering. But usually, like, okay, I have a blog. I have written blogs for this many years. How many times during those years have I wanted some form of interactivity on the site? And if the answer is never, then maybe something like Eleventy is perfect for you. It's very uncomplicated. It takes Markdown and spits out blog posts, and you have to do very little as a developer to get that running. But if you know that, like, hey, I did build out like this kind of cool nav, and that's got some JavaScript to it, and like my contact form has some some live updating based on what options you check about where, what questions it'll ask, then, okay, now I need a little bit of JavaScript. So you can do that in Eleventy, but it's a little more kind of bring your own, and you're bringing in something and kind of putting it inside of Eleventy instead of Eleventy providing the tools. Something like Astro is going to let you, build your whole site. And again, if like, are you a React developer? Then Astro is probably a really natural fit because it's going to take that React, compile it down to HTML and CSS. And then you just add like client:visible as an attribute to the React components that you want to be dynamic. And so it's a very subtle, like it's such a light on-ramp from something like Next or Gatsby into Astro and getting that huge benefit. Because the other huge benefit is like if you want to use Preact, the core of Preact is like 4 or 5 kilobytes, whereas the core of React itself is like 40 something kilobytes, right? So you're shipping a lot of JavaScript just to get the library into the browser. In Astro, you just tell it which renderer to use, and you can say like use React or Preact, and it kind of like just works. So you can immediately cut a ton of the JavaScript out of just shipping the library. And then if your button is another kilobyte of JavaScript, suddenly you're under 10K to ship interactivity on your blog. So that's kind of a long walk around to say what, that it depends. But I really do think that if, no interactivity, lots of tools that'll just give you no interactivity. Use the one that you're most comfortable with. Whether, if you write Go, use Hugo. If you write Ruby, use Jekyll. Otherwise, so I think we should actually talk just a little bit about why this is suddenly possible. And I think we got to give a lot of props to Vite. So Vite is a tool. I think Evan Yu is the biggest contributor to it, and I don't think he intended it to be this way, but it basically became the Rosetta Stone for JavaScript frameworks. And that's what, like, because of what Vite is capable of, that's why we're suddenly seeing this surge in frameworks that can read Vue components, Svelte components, web components, React components, and turn them into plain old like HTML and CSS. And so that's kind of, you know, why I think these frameworks are so exciting. Is it's like we're kind of making the framework a developer experience implementation detail, and Vite translates it into what the user actually wants, which is very little JavaScript.
Not only Vite, but like all of these, you know, very fast transpilers. I think that it's been like ESBuild has been. I like to think about it like when we first got like Steam Power going, where, you know, even without like there are a lot of things which we knew how to do, but like there was just a real limit on what you could do if it had to be pulled by horses. And suddenly, like you have things going faster. It unlocks so much more innovation because it's possible, right? You're not like I was with this other site that I was talking about, where we were already like straining because Webpack and Babel took 15 or 20 minutes to compile the whole site. And it's like, well, we have to try to do less. Like we can't do more. We have to try to do less. And now that, you know, you can say like, yeah, generate like how many pages do you want? It's instant, it's there. And I think that a lot of work on performance, which I think sometimes like is not necessarily seen as innovation, like has been like this kind of orders of magnitude improvement has unlocked a lot of things.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. I think the improvement in performance in the build tooling, and also the ability to automate so much of that, has just really unlocked so many possibilities. That's such a huge enabler. And you know, I'd also add another vote to the answer of it depends. And I don't find that frustrating. I actually find that a really helpful answer, because it usually invites the next part of the conversation, which is that next interrogation of what are the requirements and what have you. But the thing that excites me at the moment is the fact that it seems like now the answer can be both it depends and Astro or something similar, because tools such as Astro that allow you to blend different models together means that, you know, someone like me who, you know, I'm very keen on, you know, my blog it's all static. It has a few bits of interaction. It's got like a client-side search. It's got form validation, a few bits and pieces like that I wrote in JavaScript myself, because I thought it's easier for me to understand 100 lines of JavaScript that I've written rather than learning a framework, adding a framework in and doing it the framework way. However, if then we wanted to add something which is a little bit more complex, a bit more kind of has some state or what have you, then it's nice not to have to change the tool. So I'm really excited by the prospects of things such as Astro, you know, on the back of things like Vite. That means that I could build it exactly that way. But then if there's one part of the site that does need some kind of state management, what have you, it's like, fine, we'll introduce the React renderer to that, or someone else can add the Vue renderer to that. And again, it's not just contributing to a ton of bloat necessarily. It just means that you can sprinkle in these few bits and pieces. And again, it feels like the best of both worlds, where, you know, you can do the bare minimum, and the framework or the tool allows that, but then it can also support different frameworks and different technology tastes right there within it, which feels like a bit of a game changer to me. That's kind of exciting.
Yeah, I would say that, like, I think sometimes we underrate the advantages of standardization.
Yeah.
And like things becoming just like these commodity frameworks that people like just view as part of the language, and you can assume that if, you know, if we went to realize where every site built in JavaScript is built in Astro or some other like framework that can include multiple things, then it's not like, well, I'm learning JavaScript. What do I learn? Do I learn how to do this in React? Do I learn how to do this in React but with Next? And how do I deploy it? It's like there's so many things that just you don't have to concern yourself with if you're just making a website. You have to concern yourself with if you're seeking to push forward how we do things. But if you're just making a website, and that's, I know this from starting out working with ASP.NET and ASP.NET developers, where that had a lot of limitations in a lot of ways and a lot of things. It was very clunky, but you did have this thing where you could go in and say, I want to build a form. This is how I build a form. It's not like, oh, do I do it this way or do I do it that way? It was very standardized, some things that are routine in our jobs because we do them all the time should be routine in the framework. There should be all these questions of oh, well, we could use this or we could use that, because the circumstances are mostly the same, and just the advantage of it not be a question is a huge advantage.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I was going to ask, I don't have much experience with Astro. I only recently learned about it. But I've seen people use, when they have those instances of well, I have all this statically generated content that I want, and I want this small piece of interactability. I've seen people use things like Alpine. I haven't used it personally, but I was wondering if you guys have, and what your experience is if you have. No?
I haven't personally.
I've heard people talk about it. I don't exactly know how it works, but I've been led to believe that it's a similar approach, where it's kind of, you basically say this thing is interactive and it keeps that JavaScript around. But yeah, I haven't had a chance to try it yet.
Okay, yeah, it seems like from what I've seen of it anyway, you just pull in from a CDN or NPM or whatever you're using, Alpine, and then you can use attributes and tags on just the HTML that you already have, and those parts become interactive. And it's supposed to be a lightweight sort of version of it's very close to Vue, it feels like.
Yeah,
just doesn't really sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna kind of celebrate a little bit that we're starting to see innovation in the space again. I feel like we hit a bit of a lull where everybody had just kind of thrown up their hands and said well, I guess we just use React. And even in the React space, it kind of felt like we all just gave up and said, I guess we use Next now. Because even the React core team is yeah, just they're basically building stuff for Next and not really building it for anybody else as far as it kind of seems. And you've got Gatsby is doing its thing. It's still, they're still pushing along. They just put out Gatsby 4, but for whatever reason, ES Build hit, and then about the same time ES Build hit, the Rust ecosystem was spinning up, and SWC came out of that. And then we saw Vite get built on top of ES Build, and innovation just exploded. And credit to other things that came in around the same time, like Snowpack was a very kind of influential, hey, we can do better than what we're doing now. ES modules came in and actually became usable in the major browsers, so we could do modern modules, and suddenly we've got Alpine and Astro and Svelte's been around for a long time, but it just feels like innovation got unlocked again, and we're seeing that there's somewhere to go beyond what Next and Gatsby have done to the kind of the next generation of web development. I think that's really exciting, because when we say it depends, there are excellent use cases for Gatsby. There are excellent use cases for Next. And if you told me that I was going to build a fully dynamic app dashboard, the only thing you could see if you weren't logged in is a skeleton, I'm probably reaching for Next. It's an excellent tool for that. But I don't know. I feel like we got into a little bit of a rut as an industry where we were saying like, well, the only tool we have is Next, so we'll use that as the hammer and make every problem into a nail. And so I'm really, really excited that we are now at a place where we have choice. And I'm even more excited that the choices we can make don't mean we have to use different frameworks. We can have a React component library. I can ship my marketing sites in Astro. I can ship my blog in Astro. I can ship, my contact forms and my light interactivity, all using the React component system, using Astro, and ship 0 JavaScript because it's not super interactive, maybe 30, 40 kilobytes of JavaScript. And then the app is entirely interactive. You're going to be logged in, and we know that's okay. You're going to make the trade-off. You're going to use Next. You're going to load that 500 kilobytes or megabyte of JavaScript, and it's going to be completely interactive, completely pulled dynamically. That's a great use of Next. But we still get to use the React component library, that shared library. So that to me feels like a good leap forward for the industry. I'm pretty excited about it.
Agreed.
Astro having a server-side render for the bits that you use Next for. I think that might be, because again, I think using both at the same time, it's certainly better than using, Next and then just some HTML or something for the marketing site. You can at least share the components. But I think there's some point of convergence there of like, what is an app behind all of these login screens and blogs except just like one big dynamic component? And there's probably a place there for like, putting that in a way that is intuitive. I think that one of the things as well is I think as developers, we stop thinking about what's the server and what's the client. With React, it was just, it's all React and the same code gets executed in both. And then, Next and Nuxt like opened that up shimmied that up a little bit and said, no, there's all of these like, if you give up on this sort of dream of full isomorphism, there's a lot of things which you can do on the server that you just can't do on the client in terms of, just use the database client directly. Just have like a sequential async pipeline that you don't have to worry about it being interrupted because it's happening on a server and it won't respond until it's done. And all of these things, like it unlocks in some ways like a simpler solutions to problems that used to be simple and became complex because suddenly we had to do it in this incredibly complex environment of running it on somebody else's browser instead of on a machine that we control.
Yeah, I think another exciting thing in that space is like Next and Nuxt give us really, really powerful server-side controls. And we also now have much more readily available access to serverless functions, which are kind of the same general approach. And we know that this is it's solving the right kinds of problems because just about every framework at this point has built in their own proprietary serverless function support. So Next API routes, Gatsby API routes, these are serverless functions under the hood. And then you can get them in a more generic way using like Netlify functions is kind of a no config way to do serverless functions on any framework. AWS Lambda is getting easier to use. Azure's got function support so that you can do serverless functions. And all of these mean that you can write these really client heavy apps and just have like that little bit of backend that you need, like, I need to process an image. I need to do something with an API key, that kind of stuff that you can't ship to the client. Now you just do it in like 15 lines of serverless function code and it just goes away. You don't have to stand up a node server. You don't have to worry about scalability. None of those complicated pieces of like the ops or release management of a server. You just get to have that little bit of server functionality in a quick to ship serverless function. And that just, I feel like that when that really sunk in for me, I started to feel like the myth of the full stack dev didn't necessarily need to be a myth, because a lot of what keeps people from being full stack devs is that it's really, really difficult to understand all of the supporting skills required to be full stack. Like when you get into the back end, it's not just, can I write server code? It's, can I write and deploy and scale and operationalize back-end code? Because there's just so many pieces and moving charts. But we have third-party software for just about everything, databases, CMSs, everything can be run as a third-party system. We've got serverless functions that don't require any ops or management or scaling management. And like, I can write a few lines of Node. That's the back end I understand. So, I'm not going to ever go and put like, I'm a full stack dev on my resume, but like, can I get us 85% of the way to a full stack app? I mean, I can, right? That's pretty empowering as a front end dev now, to be able to realize, yeah, I can do all that back end stuff. I don't need to ask a team, because I can process a form input. I can handle this image submission. Like, all that stuff is now possible to me because I don't have to figure out how to stand up the server.
Yeah, I think service, and I'm hearing that we will get some exciting news about Cloudflare workers. Coming out of this. They've been teasing their development of more developer tools and more ways of doing serverless. So I'm excited to see all of the innovation that comes from that, because one of the things that serverless functions solve, like I've spent a lot of my professional life like in the backend and worrying about things like, our servers are in a different continent than our customers. And so the more like we can do like to ship things to the edge, to ship things that are small and can transmit, and yeah, I guess like to have somebody else handle the really hard things like database sharding, and so on is just great, because you could get a 4-year degree on databases, and that was a lot of like, what is, being a backend devs is just databases, and it's like, well, maybe we can just have the really specialized, really good people like working on like how to have a database have like fast and secure access from anywhere in the world, which is a really, really hard problem. But it would be good if we could solve it just once, rather than every company solving it internally with their own tools.
And this is what's so exciting, because like we just saw PlanetScale hit the market, and it's exactly that. It's like a globally distributed Postgres database with like branching support. I never have to think about databases again now, because between PlanetScale and Supabase and like MongoDB's got a globally distributed option now, and Firebase, like there are so many, FaunaDB, they've all got these managed database solutions. Each one is good for different use cases. So, you can measure up like, what kind of data am I storing for what purpose, and look at what all these companies are offering. And then I can just click a button and have a database. And it's going to do all that stuff. It's going to be globally sharded. It's going to be replicated. I'm going to have rollback capabilities. I have my, like, all the things that I need that would have required me to hire a database specialist and an ops specialist and I need a whole ops team. I need a whole, like, just a whole back-end department to run these really complicated problems. I can now outsource, from when I'm experimenting on the free tier of these apps. And if I'm a company, for significantly less than what I would have spent for like one developer salary. So ops overhead is you don't even need to solve it with money anymore. You can just solve it by using one of these tools that kind of did the hard work for you.
And that's always what drives innovation forward. It's like these really specialized tools becoming commoditized, becoming something abstracted that you can just pay someone and take it off the shelf, and it comes in a can. You don't have to think about it. And how much, now that, when we don't have people having to worry about how to set up the database, like what can those people be developing and inventing?
Yeah, I love that shifts the opportunity then to being creative about the experience and the utility you're providing to the the customers, the users, whoever it is that's at the other end of that experience. Having agencies with big development teams who are solving database concerns isn't anywhere near as exciting as just leveraging all of those resources and those bits of expertise that you just mentioned, and then having that team try and figure out what's the best experience we can create, and how can we differentiate by bringing better utility and better experience to the end user, rather than we'll differentiate by our site doesn't go down. It would be nice if that's just table stakes, and then we differentiate with the fun stuff. That for me makes working in the web development kind of arena just way more exciting. So yeah, it's interesting times, I think.
Do you guys think that perhaps like that is the reason we're seeing this resurgence of server side and static site generation? Like, because we talk about innovation, but a lot of that's not new. That's how things were done. So do you think like not having to care about the database, not having to care about, well, I've got to manage my own in-house servers because everything is in functions and in the cloud, and I have all these resources managed for me at my fingertips, we can go, we're going back towards, well, now it's not expensive or complicated to run this on a server, and it gives me performance, it saves me time, it allows me to better cache these assets that, aren't changing. And is that what you guys are, I don't know, thinking?
Go ahead.
I think that's a little bit like that, because I think the way, and I'm old but not that old, so I wasn't there for when like the big server rendering frameworks came out, but I think the story is a bit like, at first you just have static HTML and you can build the static HTML with Bash and make files, and you essentially have a static site generator. But then you start being like, well, we need these things, we need them to update when we change the database. And if we want them to update whenever we change something in our database, then like we have to have a server. And since we have to have a server anyway, and we have to have an ops team anyway, we have to have like a data center, then, we can save resources by just having PHP or ASP.NET or something that is this big framework that combines all of the bits of having a server that you needed, of databases and database connectors and models, with essentially like generating the HTML. And now, since we don't have to run the server, I think that has prompted this idea of like, well, if we don't have to run the server for all these other things, like, what is it doing? Like, why are we actually like hosting this HTML generation? Like, couldn't we just do it beforehand? And if we don't even need a server to do it, because we have these deployment pipelines like Netlify, which do it for us, we can rebuild always in reaction to a change without a server. Then suddenly having a server is the big cost. Can we avoid it somehow?
And I think it could be hard as well to come to exactly that realization, particularly if you've been building things in a particular way for a long time. And you mentioned we want things to change when content in the database changes. We want things to change, and that's been a very well-trodden path for a long time. And I think one of the fundamental shifts has been how quickly things can be redeployed based on a change happening somewhere. Because for the longest time, I had all of my content in a MySQL database, and I had PHP in front of it, and that's how I manage my content. Because in my blog, I wanted to be able to easily update content without updating the code and redeploying my site. Because redeploying the site was, maybe it would take a little bit of time, maybe it would have some risk associated with it, and so it made sense for that abstraction to happen and for the server to be smart enough to do all of that for me on demand whenever a request came in, and automate the kind of the changes for me. but as soon as it came to be that deploying was not, something that you'd have a team for, and you'd say, okay, we'll have a code freeze and a content freeze so that we can do the deploy, go through all of the different environments and make sure everything's okay. As soon as that was automated to the point of next to zero friction and next to zero cost in doing a deploy, then at that point, I think, well, having content changing in a database, that's fine. That can trigger a deploy, and things can all happen, ahead of time. And I think it's that automation and that kind of those utilities and what have you that have really accelerated this shift to being able to say, well, why do we need a server in our kind of problem space in keeping the site alive? But it can be a difficult, I don't know, it's almost like an emotional wrench to get over, taking that away, because that's been the crutch for the architecture for such a long time. And so having that shift in mental model, I think isn't necessarily easy until you kind of tackle it.
I kind of want to take a really philosophical stab at that question, because I feel like this isn't something that's limited to web development. So bear with me for a second. But when we look at innovation, I think there's a term that I read once called the adjacent possible, which is the idea that as we create new things, it's like going through a series of doors. Like, you have to open the first door before you can get to the second door. And you don't really know what's behind the first door until you've opened it. And so a lot of things that seem impossible now, if we open enough doors, they won't seem impossible anymore. And so I think that we, at certain points in the industry and in any point of innovation, we're going to open a door that suddenly there are a lot of new doors behind that one. And I think that some of the innovation that we've seen recently, and I think that some of the big ones are, what we've talked about, ESBuild, Vite, ES modules, things like that these are big steps forward, that suddenly there are a lot of new doors that we can open. And I think the other thing too is the amount of tooling that's coming out to remove work, the things that allow us to be air quoted full stack developers, because so many of these services exist that do all the back end stuff for us. It's we could argue that when the Renaissance happened, it was just because a lot of really talented artists all got born in the same few decades, right? But that's not really an accurate way to look at it. What actually happened was, for whatever reason, it became fashionable to have patrons and for rich people to provide for artists and take away all of the blockers in their lives. I'll pay your rent. I'll make sure you're fed. I'll make sure you have access to tools. And suddenly creative people weren't struggling to survive anymore. They were able to just be creative. And we saw flourishing of art, right? And all these beautiful things happened. And I think that what we're seeing right now in front end is the same thing. All of the things that were keeping us from being creative and innovating were chores and admin work and stuff that we weren't really interested in doing, but we had to do it to keep the lights on. Suddenly these tools and platforms are coming in that are removing those chores and that admin work that we weren't really interested in, but took up a lot of our time. And so we now have wiggle room. We've got fewer problems. And so we've got more bandwidth to explore and to innovate. And we're seeing the fruit of that, where developers are suddenly able to build some really incredible stuff completely on their own, because a lot of the things that were in their way got removed by these tools that are doing the chores for them. So it's kind of spiraling off into the stratosphere a little bit like that. But I think that those are, I think about this a lot because, I love whenever you see an explosion in creativity, and it feels like this is one of those.
Well, that's an amazing thought to close off with, because we're getting to time. Does anyone else have something that they want to say? What are you looking forward to? What are you going to look up after this call has ended to look more into?
I don't feel like I'm going to top Jason's Renaissance. I'm going to keep my mouth closed.
It's interesting to hear you talk about earlier about 5 years time, not knowing what you're going to be doing, and it just makes me think in 5 years time what this ecosystem is going to look like, because this it changes so dramatically, and it's amazing to see the inspiration and the things that are coming out of it. And I'm certainly inspired after this, just hearing, all the discussions around the different tools. I've wrote a couple of notes, things I'm going to, certainly go and check out. But yeah, thank you.
Nice.
Yeah, shout out to the people behind Veet, who are apparently the Leonardo da Vinci of our age. Wait, no, if they're the ones removing blockers, maybe they're like the Pope.
Yeah. I'm sure, Evan, you will be thrilled to learn this.
This is not where I thought we were going to end up in this conversation.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all so much.
Awesome. Yeah,
That's
thanks
all.
so much.